So we're going to start back up with sheep and goats, and our two presenters for sheep and goats today are Dr. Jessie Lay and Morgan Wemmer. Hailing from Boyle County, Dr. Jerusha Lay has over 25 years of experience as a large animal veterinarian, as well as small animals. She left private practice to join the land grant program at Kentucky State University at the KSU Land Grant Program State Extension as our state extension veterinarian. For 6 years, she's been giving presentations and teaching classes at KSU related to animal health and welfare. Every day, she works diligently to collect information on the latest health issues in animal agriculture and finds ways to present them to the public in an informative yet user-friendly way. And for those that don't know, Dr. Lay is responsible for this program the past couple days, so we really appreciate her putting this stuff together. Morgan Wemmer is an extension assistant for livestock programming at KSU and a recent graduate of Eastern Kentucky University's livestock management program. Morgan's passionate about small ruminants. She has showed and bred Boer goats since childhood and was previously a lambing technician at EKU's Meadowbrook Farm. In addition to assisting with livestock programming at KSU, Morgan also helps coordinate the Third Thursday thing. And if you don't know what Third Thursday is, it's a monthly educational program that takes place here at the Research and Demonstration Farm on the third Thursday of every month, except for I think maybe November and December?
December. November is Small Farms Conference.
All right, so 11 months of the year, the third Thursday of each month, you can come here and learn about different things for free and lunches provided. That's the end of that. So let's welcome Morgan and Dr. Lay.
Hey, thank you guys for coming. So we were already kind of behind schedule, and I like to talk. So if I go over an hour, somebody throw something at me. That's y'all's job up front. All right? So like they said, I never thought I'd be standing up here. I'm a veterinarian. I practiced in Boyle County forever until wrestling cows got the best of my hips and knees, and got tired of being on call 24/7, and I was like, you know what? Wouldn't it be great if I could go teach farmers how to prevent these train wrecks before they get there? So that was the plan. All right. So how many people have chickens, thinking about getting chickens? Okay. How many people got sheep and goats? Okay, still several. All right. How many people got little girls with you wrapped around their finger? All right, it's coming, it's coming. I remember when I was a kid, I was the daughter of a high school ag teacher, and I was his princess, right? We had a rule, right? And the rule was, if I wanted an animal, when I got home from school, it had to eat before I could eat, right? That went along fine, and he finally put his foot down when we weren't having supper till 9 o'clock. So that brings us here. The reason I created this program, or this event this weekend, is I do a lot of producer meetings, right? But the thing is when you're producing 100 sheep or 100 goats, you're going to do things a certain way. Producing things on a small scale, right? If you just start Googling, you know, what's the best way to do this? What's the best way to do that? It's not always practical, right? Being able to do things on a small scale is a whole different ballgame. So as we go through today, right, I'm going to focus on how to do things if you've got 10 acres or less, right? So if you have lots and lots of sheep and goats, right, then we can step up and start doing some of the more production efficient things. So first, let's think about why would you get sheep and goats, right? So meat, obviously, lamb. Lamb chili is amazing, right? Wool, right? Fiber. They've got a new thing with some milking sheep. I haven't worked with that a whole lot. I'm still doing my homework on the milking sheep thing, all right? Now goats, lots of dairy goats, soaps, lotions, right? Goat's milk is one of the most digestible. So a lot of people that have problems with cow's milk actually can tolerate goat's milk better. Meat from goats, right? Weed control, that's a new up-and-coming thing. Browsing projects, using goats to clear some of those like really overgrown forest areas. And then, of course, the enjoyment of it, right? The reason we're all here trying to be homesteaders is we've all got a little bit of cowboy in us, right? Now, to what degree, we'll see. The animals are going to get bigger all day. Right. So, facility requirements. Right? You got 10 acres, what can you have? In general, if you have good pastures during the summertime, right, you can put 4 to 5 per acre, right? But we've also got to factor in if you're going to be breeding animals, right? And then you have to have a separate pen for your buck, right? If you're going to have young animals and you're going to have to wean them, right, we're going to have to put some fences to separate them. So, if you're like, I got 10 acres total, right? So, 4 per acre, you got to factor in the shelter, where your barn's going to be, how much space that's taking up, and then adjust for if you're going to have multiple life stages, keeping them in separate pens, right? We'll go through each of these in a little bit more detail. So shelter options, right? So this is, one place where you can save a little bit of money if you're doing things on a small scale, right? In Kentucky, you drive down the roads and you'll look off to the side and you see these beautiful old tobacco barns. They're huge, right? To build a large tobacco barn, right, that is going to be really, really expensive. And you're like, man, I just have like 5. Right? You can actually get some shelters, right, that are going to be much more efficient, right? What you see up there at the top, that's actually a portable shelter. We have one out back. So as you leave today, you can kind of look in the goat fields and see some of these portable ones, right? Little prefabricated sheds, you can use those. Or you can even have just a run-in shed off to the side of a small barn, right? All of these work, right? If you want to build a barn, the hoop barns work well for sheep and goats, right? And then you can also use them to store hay, and they're a whole lot cheaper than building the traditional big wood, metal roof tobacco barns, right? Anybody here had cows before? Right? So cows are much, much more cold tolerant, right? So let's think about this, right? I'm not a PhD, right? I'm a vet, I come from the practical land, right? Cows have a leather jacket on, literally, right? They're wearing a leather jacket, so it's snowing, they're cool, right? Sheep and goats don't. Their skin is a whole lot thinner, right? A cow's skin is about 2 inches thick. Right? It can be snowing all over them. They're cool. They're comfortable at about 40, 50 degrees. Right? Sheep and goats aren't like that. Their skin is a whole lot thinner. Right? So that's why we've got to protect them from the elements. And we don't cows. Right? Sometimes sheep and goats are little cows, but a lot of times they're not. Okay. So when we start talking about some of the other things, we're going to have to consider our feed and water troughs, handling facilities. Like I said, we're still pretty early in the day. So here's the top is a stand, right? So the top photo, that's a sheep or goat stand where you can put them in there and you latch their head, right? The one on the bottom for dairy goats, if you're milking, right? If you're just raising meat animals, right, on a small scale, like I said, we've got less than 10 acres here. We're still early enough in the day. These things are small enough we can manhandle them if we have to, right? So you don't have to have a chute and a whole running tub, anything like that. So if you can get somewhere where you can get them pinned up, where you can grab them, they're still manageable by hand. All right, so feeders and waterers, right? So waters, we've got to keep them clean, right? Where were my goat people? If you put a bucket of water in a stall with a goat, it will intentionally poop in it and then refuse to drink it. That's what they do. I think they just like to watch us clean it, right? But goats are super, super finicky about their water being dirty, right? Grain feeders. So the feeder at the top, I hate, absolutely hate that feeder, right? Can anybody tell me why? Yes. Actually, no. What happens in that top feeder, if you look at the end of the hay, the edge of it, right? What happens when you have lambs or kids, right? If you've ever seen them jumping and playing, right? That's what they do. But whenever you have one of those, if you get that feeder and it's got an open end on that hay rack, always put something in there, because those little kids, those little lambs are going to jump up where the hay is, and they will break their legs in those slots. So always, if you're going to have a feeder like that, it's great because you can put your hay and your grain right there, right? It's convenient. But if you ever buy a feeder like that, make sure at the end of the hay slots, get a piece of plywood or a piece of like chicken wire or something, but cover this end where the kids and the lambs can't jump up in there. These feeders also work great. They can be a little bit harder to clean, right? Because after you fed them, right, you put your pellets or your loose feed in there, there's always that dust that collects, right? That dust. And then when it rains, that dust turns into like that powder gets wet and it cakes up in the edges. So a lot of times if you've got one of those, if it doesn't have a drain hole, you can drill a little hole to make sure that water's going to drain out of it. And I clean those things at least once every couple weeks. Right? Okay. Here's another soapbox I want to get on, y'all. All right. So minerals. Let's see. All right. So minerals. If anybody's ever seen a deer or a cow, if you look at their nose, it's kind of square, and then they have that like sandpaper tongue. Has anybody ever felt a cow's tongue? It is. It's like sandpaper. Really, really rough. And when you put a salt block out there or a mineral block, when they lick it, that sandpaper takes off layers. Right? Sheep and goats don't have that. They're not little cows. Right? If you look at the nose of a sheep or goat, it's like a rabbit. It's got that little cleft, and they can wiggle it back and forth. Right? Their tongue isn't rough. Right? They can't eat off of blocks. But if you go to the feed store or you go to Tractor Supply, they're going to say, here's some sheep and goat blocks. Right? Don't ever do that. Right? All right, so my other soapbox, right? So goats have to have copper. It's an essential mineral for them, okay? Sheep, if sheep get too much copper, it'll kill them. So once again, when we start talking about buying mineral for these guys, if you walk in to a feed store and they have one bag that says sheep and goat mineral, what are y'all thinking, right? Right. If you can feed it to all different species, it's not good for any of them. Okay? Right? Because like I said, the copper will kill the sheep, but the goat's got to have it. So if you can feed this to both of them, it's useless. Right? Each feed, each mineral, right? Somebody much smarter than me has been in a lab and calculated exactly how much calcium, exactly how much copper, how much selenium, protein levels, and they have it completely balanced to what the animal needs. And it's for a specific animal, right? Just regular sweet feed that you can feed to horses, sheep, lambs, don't do that, right? Because if it's just a general feed, it hasn't been balanced to meet the needs of the animals. So, I don't know why they sell that stuff. Drives me crazy. Sorry, I'll move on. All right, so guard animals. I have guard animals in with facilities, right? Right. Guard animals have a purpose, right? They have a job to do. I've known some people that have taken Great Pyrenees and tried to put them in little 2-room apartments. Doesn't work well, right? These guys, they need to have a job, right? To protect and serve, that's their job, right? But now they're still dogs. So if you make pets out of them, right, they're going to be in the backyard when something comes into the flock, right? It's the hardest thing in the world to do. Have y'all ever seen a Great Pyrenees puppy? They are cute, right? You're telling me not to pet it, right? That's insane. But we got to be strong. We got to be strong, right? If we're constantly petting on them, loving on them, right, then we're going to turn them into pets. And when they need to do their job, they're not going to be there. Right? Okay. They're still going to need their vaccines, right? We're putting them out there to protect, the sheep and goats from wild animals, right? What disease does wild animals, right? Rabies, right? You're going to have to make sure you stay on top of their vaccines, especially things like Lyme disease and rabies vaccines, right? Appropriate flea and tick control, right? Because they can't do their job. They can't work if they're not being taken care of, right? And they need to be raised with the animals, right? This goes all the way back, right? You can't just get a 5-year-old dog that's never seen a goat and throw it in and think they're just going to live in the barn, right? Doesn't work, right? So whenever you get a puppy, right, make sure you do your vaccines. We're going to deworm it and do all of the vet care, right? But as a puppy, you want to put it into a stall, right, with the animals it's going to be protecting, right? You want that animal to think it is one of the herd, right? You leave it in the barn, you leave it with them, right? You let it bond with the animals, right? If it's up at the house because it's cold outside, right, it doesn't make that connection with the animals. Right? Same thing for donkeys, right? You don't want to buy just a donkey that's never seen any sheep before and throw it out in the field with them, right? And maybe it's used to the adults, right? You throw it in and you're like, okay, all right, this is going well, looks good, right? And then they lay them, and it's never seen that little screaming thing before. It thinks it's a toy, right? So you want to make sure whatever guard animal you get has been raised around the species that it's getting ready to protect, right? The biggest health problem with donkeys is donkeys metabolically can live on almost nothing, right? So if they get too many calories, if the pasture's too lush, right, they get really fat, and it can cause certain diseases with their feet, right? So if you get a donkey, you don't want to overfeed it, right? Alpacas, a lot of people use alpacas, but they are very sensitive to heat stress and meningeal worms. So alpacas can be used, right? But a lot of times you're going to have to shear them in the spring. I mean, because they can have heat stress even at 80 degrees if the humidity's high enough. And, let's face it, Kentucky weather, right? It gets really hot and humid in the summer very often. All right, so fencing, right? So perimeter fences around the outside of the farm, those need to be your strongest fences. I'm telling you a lot of ways to cut corners when you're getting started. This isn't the place to cut corners. The perimeter fence needs to be strong, right? It's going to keep the animals in. It can keep some of the predators out, not all of them, right? And goats are notorious for being able to get out. Sheep are a whole lot easier. Sheep, they're like, oh, there's a fence. Okay, fine. Goats, no. Goats like to jump, right? If you go back to where they are originally from, they climb mountains. They like to jump on top of things. So goats are much, much harder to keep in, right? Strong fences make good neighbors, right? You can use electric fences, even around the bottom of the fence. You can have like a standoff strand. That will be a deterrent as well. When you're using woven wire fences, all right? Everybody know what woven wire fences are? All right. So in cattle, when you look at the standard woven wire fence, the squares are usually 4 by 6 inches, right? In sheep and goats, they make 4 by 4 squares, right? So the woven wire is just a little bit different, right? But the problem I find with the 4 by 6s is it's just big enough for goats to stick their head through, right? And then they stick their head through it. Well, when they go to pull their head back, their horns are stuck, right? And they get stuck, and they'll be there till somebody comes and gets them out, right? They're not real smart. And they won't just do it once and learn their lesson. They'll do it every day, right? Yes, right? So go ahead and save yourself some problems. If you haven't got the fence up yet, when you go to put it up, it's not that much of a cost difference, but do it right the first time, right? And it saves a whole lot of headaches. Okay. All right. Purchasing your stock, right? A reliable source, right? If you can find someone, right, that's been raising sheep or goats, when you go there, look at all their animals, right? Look, do their animals look healthy, right? It's perfectly fine, right? When you get something off Craigslist, I mean, sometimes y'all know you get a real deal, right? Right? But you get what you pay for, right? When you buy an animal and you don't know what its history is, right? You could be bringing all kinds of diseases back onto your farm, right? It's kind of funny when I talk about biosecurity and contagious respiratory diseases, right? These are herd animals we're talking about, right? I've never had any luck getting one to wear a mask or stay 6 feet away from each other, right? But the good news is they're not going to Walmart either, right? So once it's in a herd, they're not going to social distance, right? But we have more control on what's coming in and out, right? So that's why it's so important when you go to buy these animals, right? Getting them from somewhere, right, that's been vaccinating, right? And it's completely okay to ask history, right? When you go buy an animal, right, that's the first thing you ask them. What vaccines do you usually do? Has this one been dewormed? Have you ever had any problems with this? I mean, sometimes make it into a conversation, like, you ever had anything with an abscess pop up, or, right, and just, make it a conversation, but it's okay, right? You're like, well, I didn't want to ask them. No, you need to ask, right? Because that way, they might give you a heads up of diseases the animal could be carrying and not showing any symptoms, right? Always check their feet, right? Especially sheep people, right? Foot rot, a certain infection of the foot is super contagious, right? When that animal comes in, right, it's got foot rot till proven otherwise. It's that important. It comes in, it goes in a fence by itself, right? It goes in a pen, right? And stays in that pen for 2 weeks until we're sure it's not getting sick, right? And when I say quarantine an animal, right, a lot of these respiratory viruses can be transmitted by breathing, right? And I always kind of have to laugh because you've got to have 2 fences in between them and the rest of the herd, right? 2 fences. Because if you just have one fence separating them from the herd and you throw them in that field, what's the first thing they do? They run up and they sniff each other between the fences, right? And they're breathing right on each other. Those fences aren't airtight, right? So make sure you have 2 fences in between them, because they're curious, and that's the first thing they're going to do is go smell each other through the fence. Okay. Okay. All right, I'm going to take a break and let Morgan, my program assistant, she's going to cover nutrition and breeding, and then I'll be back up to talk about diseases.
Hello, my name is Morgan, like she said. With nutrition, it is extremely important to feed a species-specific feed, so a feed that is made for sheep or a feed that is made for goats. Because of that copper, goats need it, it'll kill the sheep, and they have different protein requirements, they have different nutrient requirements with minerals and things like that. It's also important to feed based on their production stage. So if you have a doe or a ewe that is lactating and she's feeding triplets versus a wether that is just chilling in the field, they're going to need very different feed because of that. The lactating ewe or doe is going to need more protein and more calcium than that wether. That wether's going to need very minimal nutrient requirements because it's not producing anything. It's extra. It's just maintaining itself. Super young animals are also going to need more protein. They're growing. Also, browsers versus grazers. Your goats are going to be browsers, so they're going to like those leafy and woody plants. So trees, shrubs, things like that. Sheep are going to be your grazers, so they're going to like that grass, and they're going to graze through the pasture that way. So they eat different things. It affects, Dr. Lay will get into that as well. It'll affect their parasites and things like that as well. Breeding. Sheep and goats are seasonal breeders. So short day, meaning they are in heat in the fall and the winter. So they kid and they lamb in the spring. Their estrus cycle is about 18 days, so that is one heat to the next. Gestation length is going to be about 5 months. 145 to 150 days, that's a guesstimate. They can go less, they can go more, a little bit. And females, we do not want them bred until they're about 80% of their adult body weight. Usually wait to breed them until they're about 18 months old, so they're kidding, lambing at about 2 years old, to not affect that growth and to make sure that they're big enough and old enough to be able to produce the milk that those kids and those lambs are going to need, and that they're old enough to birth those animals safely. You're going to want to keep your males and your females separate because some goats can cycle year-round, and kidding in super cold weather is a little more stressful on the animal and you. So keep those separate. And like Dr. Lay had said earlier, goats like to get out. If there is a fence, it's like an obstacle course to them. So those males and those females either have a stronger fence between them or a whole pasture between them. Make sure that those males can't accidentally get in, so that way you know when you're going to have kids or lambs on the ground. And if you only have 1 or 2 does or 1 or 2 ewes, you might want to look into borrowing or leasing a male. With that comes some potential risks like disease, and things like that, because anytime an animal leaves your farm and comes back, it can bring something back with it, including foot rot, respiratory illness, things like that. So you want to make sure you're quarantining when those animals come onto your farm, or if you are sending your females to someone else's farm, make sure you quarantine them before releasing them to the rest of the herd. Just economic sake, if you have 2 does and 1 buck, you've got to feed that buck all year when you might only use him for 2 months in the fall or the winter. So that's just something to keep in mind there. During lambing and kidding, you're going to expect multiples. Singles are rare. Twins are very common. Triplets are common. 4 and 5 is not unheard of. So always expect another one. There are 3 stages of labor. In the first stage, you're going to notice them talking to you. They're kind of bleeding kind of quietly, almost like they're trying to have a conversation with you. They might be up and moving a lot, up and down, like they can't get comfortable. Stage 2, they're going to be actively pushing. And that's when you should start to see those 2 front hooves and the nose. If they have been pushing for 30 minutes and you're not seeing any kind of progress or anything, there may be an issue. So either there's a traffic jam when you've got 2 kids and she's got 2 kids, 3 kids, whatever, they're all trying to come out at once sometimes, and they can't do that. They've got to come out one at a time. So sometimes you've got to push one back and let the other one come first. And if you're not sure what's going on, you can always call a vet. I very recommend having a vet on call when you are in lambing and kidding season. And stage 3, expelling the placenta. So that they're going to do on their own. Can take up to 24 hours. If it goes much more than that, there could be issues, so you're going to want to call a vet. After kidding, after lambing, always check their udder and always check their FAMACHA score. So FAMACHA is going to be that eyelid color. It's going to show signs of anemia, and which is a sign, if they're low and anemic, a sign of that barber pole worm that Jesse will talk a little more about later. Their udder, you want that to be smooth and soft. If it's hard and lumpy or hot, it could be mastitis, so you'll want to get that looked at. Also, make sure the kids and lambs can get milk. Sometimes there's calcium deposits at the end of that teat that you're going to want to strip out so that because it looks like they're feeding, it looks like they're getting plenty, but the milk can't get past that calcium deposit, so you always want to check that as well. Make sure your kids are nursing pretty quickly after birth to make sure you want that colostrum right away as soon as possible. If you have to have bottle babies, must get colostrum within the first 8 hours. Really, we like to see it in the first 2. It is key for their immune system. This colostrum is going to be their immune system for the first 3 to 4 months of their life. Milk or milk replacers is specific to species, so make sure you're doing that. Specific, you're getting a sheep. If you raise sheep, sheep milk replacer. If you're raising goats, goat milk replacer. If you can, and you have a doe that you can milk and use that, that's great. Or a ewe that you can milk and use that, that is also great. When they're first born, you want to feed them every 4 hours on the clock. As the kid gets older, you can increase the amount of milk you're giving them at a time and feed them less frequently. But at the first couple weeks, you're going to want to, on the dot every 4 hours. You can also add in a Clostridium antitoxin to that milk replacer. The vaccination process, CD&T, it's extremely important to vaccinate against. There's multiple brands you can get, and it commonly leaves the reaction at the injection site. So if you see something like that and you knew you've given a CDT vaccine recently, then it's okay. Younger unvaccinated animals, you're going to give the initial vaccine and then a booster again. Adult animals, you're going to give a yearly booster about 1 month before kidding. And then Dr. Lay is going to talk about castration. So thank you.
Okay, I'm back. I know. I'll try, we'll get through this as fast as we can. Okay, so I've been being really basic so far. As we start talking about different processes, especially when I get into parasites, I could talk for days and days on end, right? But we will have more advanced classes for homesteaders, but you know, we don't want to leave anybody behind. So we're starting out like really, really basic, but if you have any more questions, I'll be around all day and we'll do some more advanced programs as well. All right, so disbudding. Disbudding is on goats is usually only done dairy animals and then show wethers, right? Most of the time, we're going to leave the horns on them, right? It's a painful procedure, right, that we don't want to do if we don't have to, right? Banding needs to be done early, right? You guys have seen the banders that you squeeze. I don't think I have a picture, right? And the little green rubber bands, right? Those need to be done before they're usually 3 to 4 months old. Once those testicles get too big to fit through that bander, if you're going to castrate them when they're 6 months old, it's going to have to be done by a vet. They're going to have to be put under anesthesia, right? So I usually band them somewhere around 2 months, right? All right. Oh, there we go. Right. So now we're going to get into parasites, right? So, oh boy, this is the biggest issue. Sheep and goats in Kentucky, probably the #1 killer of sheep and goats, right? Okay. So there are multiple types of worms, right? There's tapeworms. There's coccidia. Coccidia technically aren't worms. I'll get to it in a minute. But there's what we call the hot complex. On a fecal, we really can't tell these apart. But ostratagia is the worm most common in cattle. But in sheep and goats, the most common parasite that we're dealing with in this area is Haemonchus contortus, right? Big, long Latin word, but we call it the barber pole worm. So here's why it's so dangerous, right? So I don't know that I've ever really seen a barber pole, but the candy cane, right? That red stripe. If you look at this picture, you see that worm that's really zoomed in, but that's one worm, right? That red spiral that you're seeing, right? That's actually because this worm, right? It gets into the lining of the stomach and it burrows into the wall of the stomach, right? And it sucks blood, right? So that red spiral is the worm digesting the blood that it's just drank. Aren't y'all glad I got up to talk while y'all were eating? All righty. All right. So one worm isn't that big of a deal, right? And if in Kentucky, if you find a goat that doesn't have any worms at all, you better check it because it's probably a unicorn, right? They're all going to have some parasites, right? But the immune system, a healthy animal can deal with it if it's mild loads, right? Just a few of them, right? That's kind of normal, right? But you see this other picture? You can get tens and thousands of them, right? And what did I say they're doing? They're in there sucking blood, right? So when you have that many worms and they're all burrowed in at the same time, continuously sucking blood, it's the equivalent of the animal bleeding to death internally. That's what's happening, right? That's why this worm specifically is so dangerous and so bad, right? So worms are also fecal oral transmission, right? So when we start thinking about parasite control, right, you're going to start reading all of this different stuff, but we're going to step back and we're going to have a little bit of common sense too, right? What happens, right? Eggs, right? Adults are in the stomach. They're drinking that blood. They lay eggs. Eggs come out through the feces, right? They don't have bathrooms. They just poop wherever they're walking. Those eggs hatch into little micro worms called larvae. The next animal walking by grazing eats the larva and it starts all over, right? If that's how it's going, the more animals in one spot, the more poop in one spot, right? And if that's their dinner plate, right, that's when you can get some problems. So when you start overcrowding them, right, we put more poop in one spot, right? Rotational grazing strategies, that's how they work, is they let the eggs hatch, right, on this ground, and then you move them, right? By continuously moving them, right, you're keeping the pastures clean that way, right? So decreasing exposure, got a little bit ahead of myself. So if we're going to decrease the exposure to parasites, Okay? We're going to decrease the amount of poop they're eating. Makes sense. You guys see this pretty picture? Oh, wait. See this? Isn't that pretty? So what that is, y'all, that is one drop of dew, one drop of water on a blade of grass. And all those little squiggly things are the worm larvae, right? Those little micro worms. So when that worm egg hatched, it made that little larva. But that's one drop of water. So if you have an animal coming by grazing that swallows that one drop of water, look how many larvae it's exposed to. Right? Also, the length of grass, right? So that drop of dew comes down. What does it do? It rolls down the blade of grass, right? Where is the poop? They poop, it hits the ground. It rolls off the grass. So most of your parasites are going to be on the bottom 3 inches of that blade of grass. So the shorter your grass gets, the closer to the ground. This just makes sense, right? Sometimes we got to stop back and think about it, because we start reading stuff and it gets all technical, right? But if we just think about it, right, it's not that difficult. Appropriate stocking rates, rotational grazing, cull carrier animals, right, that have a tendency to be more susceptible, right? So in parasites, we talk about something called the 80-20 rule, right? The 80-20 rule of parasites. 20% of your animals are going to hold about 80% of your parasites. It's not even, right? Some of them are going to have stronger immune systems, right? Genetically just be strong, more resistant to them, okay? So what this means is if we can figure out what 20% of our animals are holding all the worms and get rid of them, we make our entire herd stronger, right? The number one, I'm going to tell you how to figure out what that 20% is. They've always got a name, right? It's going to be your pet. When you start testing them to see, like, okay, all right, which one of these? Which one of these is the one that's always keeping parasites on the ground? It's always going to be your daughter's favorite. Never fails. But if we can identify which animals they are, right, and get rid of them, right? And when we're doing things, like I said, we're not massively producing, and a lot of you guys have small areas with just a few, and you're like, but I love her. I know, I've been there too. But if it's a recurrent problem, you've got to realize if she is continuously getting reinfected with worms and always shedding them, right? She's a danger to the other animals around her. Think about it that way, right? And so we're going to use treatments correctly. We're only going to deworm them when they need it, right? Several years ago, 20 years ago, we knew that sheep and goats parasites were the biggest problem in Kentucky. Well, all right. So we're going to just deworm them every 3 months. We know they get worms, right? That was the stupidest thing we could have done. It was stupid. Because, right, what we did was we created a problem where we've created these worms that are no longer responding to our drugs. It's bad, right? I was that kid that always had an ear infection, right? And it was like every other month, I'd go to the doctor and they'd give me that pink bubble gum medicine. Y'all remember that? Am I showing my age a little bit here? Right? And I loved it. I was like, is it time for my medicine? Right? And then one day it quit working. And they gave me this white stuff that was nasty, right? But when you give the same medicine over and over and over again, right? We've all heard what doesn't kill us makes us stronger, right? Same thing for the worms. What few worms a dewormer doesn't kill, those are the worms that are still in there and breeding, right? That's what creates your resistance. So if we just deworm them whether they need it or not, right? We can't turn around and be shocked when the drugs aren't working anymore. Okay, so coccidia. Coccidia is another very common parasite of young animals and high-producing dairy goats. But young animals is going to be the big thing, right? Coccidia, very, very common, especially in animals raised in a barn. In the environment, sunlight will kill coccidia eggs, right? So you don't see it a whole lot in pastures. But if you've got young animals and you've got them in a barn, guess what? Sunlight's usually not getting in the barn to kill those eggs, right? Right? So you're going to see it a whole lot more if you've got animals that are indoors, right? I mean, I love it. You know, I get calls all the time. They're like, well, Doc, I've dewormed this thing 3 times and it's still got diarrhea. Just check it for coccidia. And I'm like, no. So coccidia is a parasite, but it's not a worm. So a dewormer's not going to kill it, right? There's a whole different set of treatments for it. But you're never, right? If it's not on your radar, right, it can slip up and cause problems. So in young animals, if you're having diarrhea, right, they talk about unthriftiness, right? If you look at that goat, yes, it's got diarrhea, but its hair coat's dull, it's just not growing well, right? It's got a little bit of ADR, ain't doing right. Right? If you start seeing animals thin, not growing, especially if they're bottle babies, and they've been in the barn, right? Don't forget about this one. Right. So going back to the worms, I told you only deworm animals that need it, correct? Right. Well, how do you know if they need it or not? So you can do fecal tests, right? Fecal tests, you can take the samples to a vet and they'll run them and they'll tell them exactly what parasites they have, right? Whatever eggs are coming out the back end tells you whatever worms are living in the front end. Pretty easy. But there's also something called FAMACHA, whatever you want to call it, right? But this is something you guys can get certified to do yourself. Really quick training, we do it here. Takes about an hour, right? But by this, we're going to look at their eyelids and we're going to tell how many worms they have, approximately, an estimate, right? Right? What happens if you're losing blood, right? You get really pale, right? Because it's like you just turn ghost white, your lips will turn white, right? So the more pale an animal's getting, the more blood they're losing. If you don't see blood pouring out of some part of their body, where's it going, right? Generally parasites, right? So the more worms they have, the whiter their membranes are going to get, right? And we do whole trainings about this. But the ones that are a score of 4 or 5, really pale, right? We know those animals have a lot of worms, we deworm them. If they're nice and pink, right, we don't. There's a little bit of a gray area, and that gets into the training of, if it's kind of right in that middle area, it depends. Are you getting ready to breed them? Have they just been through a stressful event? That kind of thing. But that's a whole nother lecture all in itself, right? If you have sheep or goats, know this website, wormex.info, right? You can pull it up. This is a chart. This one's for goats, but they also make one for sheep, right? So it's kind of blurry, but it has all the different dewormers you can use and what the dose is. You can follow it down, and if an animal weighs 50 pounds, it tells you the dose and what your choices are, right? Now, there are some other causes of diarrhea. Like I said, lovely me going after lunch, right? Probably shouldn't do that next time. All right, so if I said that they catch worms from eating grass, right? And you have a 2-week-old lamb with diarrhea, do you think it's parasites? At 2 weeks, they're drinking milk. They're not eating grass yet, right? So we got to just think about some things. Right? So if you're seeing diarrhea in something that's not old enough to really be eating grass yet, let's start thinking about some other causes. Right? E. coli, salmonella, some of the bacterial causes. Clostridium perfringens, right? Often called overeating disease. That can be young animals or adults, right? Dietary indiscretion. There's some plants that sudden changes in diet. So there are some other things that can cause diarrhea. Like I said, especially young animals aren't going to have worms yet, right? But if it's something that's 6 months old and it has diarrhea, right? What do they say? If you hear hoofbeats, think horses, not zebras. So there are some other causes to be aware of, but you know, staying on top of parasites is probably the most important thing to do, right? So I could talk for an hour about just about any disease. I could probably talk an hour about shoelaces if I had to. But I just want to throw up a few that are contagious to people that I really want you to be aware of. All right. So this one is sore mouth. All right. This is a virus. Right. It's kind of similar to a chickenpox virus, but right, it is contagious to people. And you start seeing these little scabs, and the first time you see it, right, I'm a picker. You start picking at it, you're like, what is that? Right? It's contagious. If you have one like this, separate it from the rest of the group. And if you've touched it, please, please, please go wash your hands. Right? As any virus, it's got to run its course. It takes about 4 weeks for it to go away. Right? They're yelling at me that I'm talking too long. All right. So respiratory diseases. Right? So there are several contagious viruses. Right? When you bring an animal in, make sure that your biosecurity is good. Except they're not going to Walmart. So if you're bringing it onto your farm, it's either come in on your boots or with another animal. Right? There is a vaccine for respiratory diseases. Consult with your vet of whether or not they recommend using it. All right, so lameness, I'm going to hit this really quick, and then I'll finish up. Sorry, guys. All right. So up here at the top, I always put this picture in here because it kind of, you know, helps make my point, right? See that flat tire on that lawnmower? These animals are grazers, right? It's a process. It's their nature. They take a step, they take a bite. They take a step, they take a bite. That's what they do, right? How much grass are you going to get mowed with a flat tire, right? So if you're not taking care of their feet, right, and they're limping, they can't eat. If they don't have that normal process of walking, they're not effectively eating, right? We got to think about this. In sheep and goats, their feet grow continuously, right? They've got to be trimmed at least once a year, right? We can't forget about this. This is a maintenance. This is something, unlike cows. Man, cows are tough. You throw them out there, they're fine, right? But where sheep and goats' feet, like I said, they're not always little cows. They're going to have to be trimmed once a year. All right, factors affecting feet. Right? Some breeds are naturally going to have better feet that don't grow as much, that the hoof wall is harder. For some reason, I think black feet tend to be stronger and have less problems with cracks and overgrowth. Nutrition, right? The walking surface. If they're walking on something hard, they're going to, wear the feet down faster than if they're standing in something soft all the time. Right? So, diseases of the foot. All right, this is a big one. Bear with me now, this gets a little bit complicated. All right, so there are 2 foot diseases, right? 2 different bacteria. This is foot scald, right? Foot scald, the bacteria that causes it, is in the environment all the time, right? It's just a run-of-the-mill bacteria that's going to be in every field, everywhere. These aren't house pets, right? When it rains, they go outside. If it's been raining for 2 weeks and they're standing in water, right, they get a little bit of irritation between those toes and it gets raw, right? And you can see between the two hoofs, right, between those claws, that webbed skin in between gets raw, right? That's called foot scald. Pretty common. And by itself, you can give them some antibiotics, they recover quickly, and it's not a big deal, right? This one's not contagious, it's just naturally in the environment and comes from irritation. But then there's contagious foot rot, right? This is a whole different ballgame, right? This one's highly contagious, right? This bacteria is not everywhere. This is a contagious bacteria that gets brought in, right? And it works with that other bacteria. So you get a little bit of irritation, and then this guy comes in. This is the bad guy, right? And it actually eats through that hard hoof wall. And you can see how the bottom of this hoof is just completely rotted away until even the bone in the foot is exposed, right? This is super contagious, and when it starts running through a herd or a flock, it can just be devastating. Okay, right? So this one, like I said, they're yelling at me that I'm running out of time. So antibiotics will be the treatment. Separate it, right? You're going to have to separate it through the rest of the herd. And since it's so contagious, if you have one that has this problem, you're automatically going to start running the other animals through foot baths, right? Foot baths, you can see how happy these sheep are to be walking through that water, right? Usually zinc sulfate or copper sulfate. It's a powder that you mix with the water. I've got the recipe if you have problems, or contact your vet. They'll give you more specifics. But this can be a devastating problem for any flocks or herds. Okay, something else to mention, right? If you are pregnant, right, and you have a sheep or goat that's had a stillborn, do not touch it if there's any way to avoid it, right? There are 5 things that can all cause very, very similar symptoms, but they cause stillbirths, malformed fetuses, or abortions, right? And 3 of them can be contagious to people as well. Right? So pregnant women, if you see a stillborn, if there's any way, get your husband or your neighbor or someone else to deal with it. If you have to, wear gloves and a mask because it can even be airborne. Right? Meat processing, we actually got someone talking about that later this afternoon, so I'll skip through that. Fiber considerations. Has anybody ever seen anybody trip a sheep? Doesn't work with goats, but when we talked about handling facilities with sheep, it's awesome. Once you trip a sheep and you set it up like that, it can't move. Once you get them sitting up on their butt, you can do anything you want to them, right? Doesn't work for goats. It would take me an hour to shear one. If you've got 2 or 3, you can do that by yourself. If not, then I would recommend, getting one of the professionals to come in. And I know guys that can shear one in 5 minutes or less. It's amazing when you watch the people who are trained do it. Dairy goats, right? If you're thinking about dairy goats, right? Whenever you're thinking about milking an animal, right? This is going to be a commitment. Milking them twice a day, every day. There's no going on vacation, right? Cats are awesome pets, right? You throw feed out and come back in 3 days, they're good, right? When you have dairy animals, nope, you're committed. You're there twice a day. Or you have somebody else trained that can milk, right? So whenever you go, you're like, oh, I'd love to have some goat's milk. Think about it, right? Because that's a big commitment. Lactation, sanitation is the key. When you look at an udder, right? It's kind of tree-like structure, but there's all these cells that make milk. It goes through a system of ducts down into a little collection area, and in the end of that teat, there's just a small little canal, right? So when you look at the end of that teat where it says street canal, right? All it takes is for a little bit of bacteria to get that short distance. Once it gets in there, it can set up a life-threatening udder infection called mastitis that looks like that, right? Mild cases of mastitis, it just looks lopsided. The milk looks fine, right? But it can still have an infection brewing. The bottom picture is actually gangrenous mastitis, where gangrene can set in, right? I mean, think about it. If you leave a cup of milk sitting at 98 degrees, how long is it going to be before it stinks, right? It's gross. So just a little bit of bacteria getting in that udder can cause some really, really nasty infections. All right, drying off. When you go to dry animals off, this is even meat animals, right? Even if you're just raising lambs or kids for meat, right? The day that you go to wean, right? I usually withhold feed from mama for 24 hours, right? By suddenly cutting off her feed, right? It shocks her metabolism to make her quit producing milk, right? Because when their, mammary glands, their udder, their metabolism has been revved up to just be pouring all these nutrients out, they're eating and making milk and eating and making milk, right? When you stop the feed suddenly, right, it'll make them pull back their production, right? Whenever we talk about breeding, lactating, anything like that, my favorite professor in vet school, he always said, sex is a luxury. The body will take care of what it needs before it takes care of what it wants, right? So nutrition is probably the single most important thing you can do when you're talking about taking care of animals. And we actually have a nutritionist who's going to be here later this afternoon, so we'll cover that more there. All right, guys. Any questions? Yes.
I have a very heavy producing dairy goat. She was feeding 3-week-old triplets, and she got a leg injured with the storm. She went down really fast. She's coming back. Her leg's doing well now, but she lost a lot of weight, and I'm wondering if it messed up her rumen or something, because she's just not gaining back like I think she should be. What do you do about the rumen? Or
is she out on pasture?
Well, I've been putting her back out on pasture now.
Right.
She couldn't walk initially at all.
Right. So, like I was talking about with the lawnmower with the flat tire, when they can't eat very much, when they can't walk. But, too, you've got to think, there's just so much fat. Lactose is sugar, right? Milk is full of tons and tons of calories. So if she's high producing and she was continuing to produce milk, she is just dumping calories out of her udder. Like literally the calories are just pouring out of that girl. And if she's not taking enough in, right, they will lose weight very, very quickly. So, when problems like that happen, what I would do is I'd probably put her back up in the stall and bring food to her. And like I said, make sure she's got some good quality hay, as well as, supplementing with grain if she's high producing, just to get those calories going, right? Because it may be hard. And of course, she's in pain too and may not want to eat, right? But I would probably confine her in a stall just to make sure she's getting the nutrients.
What's your opinion on continuous suckling?
On what?
Continuous suckling.
Continuous suckling, as in just leaving them with the. Mother Nature will always do things better than we can, right? So that's what they're designed to do. The less we interfere as humans, a lot of times, the better off they are. I think I told somebody that earlier, right? Bottle babies, I've had bottle babies that have been fed the best milk replacer or even straight goat's milk but they never grow as well as the ones that are just left to do it naturally. So, leaving them with the mother, right? That's the way Mother Nature intended, and that's going to be best for the young, right? When you have dairy animals, a lot of times we pull them off because we don't want them drinking what we're trying to sell, right? And dairy animals, babies are kind of a pain. And there's research being done. Look up extended lactation in goats. Because in cows, there's a lactation curve that we'll get into this afternoon where you have to rebreed them. They have to have a baby every year to kind of restart their cycle to produce milk, right? Because if not, their milk production just slowly declines. What they're finding in dairy goats is that you can milk them 2 to 4 years without rebreeding them, right? Their milk level, if you're feeding them correctly and you haven't rebred them, right, they don't have that decrease in milk, right? So in some of these, like commercial dairies, they're only breeding these girls every 2 to 3 years, which decreases the stress on the animal because, I don't know, I don't have any kids, but I hear birth is stressful, right? I don't know. But that decreases the physiological stress on the mother, right? And like I said, on dairy farms, especially male babies are in the way, right? So if you're on a dairy farm, you don't necessarily have to breed them every year. You can look it up on as extended lactation. Also, you guys, whenever you're Googling any information, if you type in the search.edu, right, that is going to pull up resources from other universities, not just ours, but all the universities across the country. And it's going to be a reliable source, right? Backyardbreeders.com is not always reliable, right? Okay, they're yelling at me again up here.
Yeah. Hello. In Louisville, the biggest thing that the goat farmers are doing now are pygmy goats, and the park system in Jefferson County, they are now trialing a commons program where the park space that they currently spend about $500,000 a year mowing, they want to turn that into a grazing area for some of the goat farmers and sheep farmers in the county. I was wondering if there's any kind of specific thing that goat farmers need to be aware of on these kind of common grazing areas.
Fences, be careful, right? So I talked about goats and fences, right? If a fence, won't hold water, it won't hold a goat. Kidding. But yeah, so whenever you've got them in urban areas, you've got to think, if it gets out and it gets hit by a car, who's paying for that, right? So it becomes super, super important to have good fencing. So that's, something to consider ahead of time. They do make several types of electric fences, right? But, whenever we start talking about technology and electric, we got to make sure it's working all the time, right? Okay. Well, all right, so they're yelling at me. I'll be around for questions all afternoon. I'm going to take a break while we move up to pigs, and I'll be back for cattle here in an hour or so.
Thank you, Dr. Lay. So right quick, folks, we're going to go ahead and hold the raffle. I need to amend what I said earlier. It's not the brooder box up here that's up for raffle. It's the raised bed that the Tartar rep had put together that is up for raffle. So at this time, we're going to go ahead and hold that. And yep. A. So number 28.
John Mitchell.
John Mitchell.
You won.
Congratulations.